Hey everybody, sorry to do this, but somebody close to me has tested positive for COVID-19. And so instead of having in-person class today, I'm going to go ahead and record today's lecture and then open it up for discussion on Canvas. And hopefully that gives us a little bit of the back and forth that we're used to in a normal class. I'm going to go get tested and hopefully get a negative result. I'll let y'all know as soon as I know, which should be within about 48 hours. So that's the news. So today we are going to wrap up our chapter on housing demand and tenure choice. And so I'm going to open up the slides and talk you through what all's going on. Okay? Sound good? Okay. So last week we started talking about housing demand and tenure choice. We said there's a couple of different ways we can talk about how housing is demanded and ways we can measure and quantify that demand. We've talked about housing demand already in class, right? Talking about price and quantity in our urban spatial model, right? We said housing demand was, people are going to demand some quantity of housing, some size of housing, and then there's going to be some price associated with that. Researchers can also estimate demand using price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply. And so we still have that quantity element here and that price element, but now we also have income, price elasticity of demand, and income elasticity of demand. And that gives us a different way of measuring housing consumption. And the big idea here is that we can go through and basically by multiplying by price and setting price and quantity as a level of expenditure, and then taking that equation with that level of expenditure and taking logs of it, what we end up doing is getting a formula that allows us to measure housing demand without any quantity, just as a function of income and prices. So the log of housing expenditure is a function of, in this case, your income and the price of housing and your elasticities. So that's one way empirically that researchers like to measure the consumption of housing. The other way, that's a really cool way of measuring housing consumption, is thinking about it being a utility maximization choice, but taking a more complicated perspective on housing, realizing that housing is not just the consumption of square footage, it's based on other attributes, right? So when we think about housing, it's not just how many square feet the housing is, it's how many bedrooms it has, or whether it has central heating and air or not. And so a hedonic price function allows us to break housing down into those attributes and assign value to each of those attributes. And so the paper referenced in the textbook is this Grother-Mazowski paper. There are lots of hedonic price function papers out there. There are lots of examples of hedonic price functions, but what they all have in common is they all break a house down into attributes that have different values. And so basically it's like a regression equation where the coefficient tells us, okay, so each square foot is going to increase home price by $5, or an extra bedroom is going to increase the home price by $2,000, something like that. And so you can get an equation like this. This is the one that was estimated by Grother and Mazowski, where, for example, having a 2-car garage increases the value of a home by $1,270. Having each bathroom increases the home price by $800, right? And so that's what a hedonic house price model does. The hedonic approach says this good housing is broken down into these attributes that all have different values. And then we went to the next big model of housing, and that was the user cost model. And the user cost model said that we can sort of say, okay, home ownership and renting are approximate because the per unit costs can be the same. What's going to be different is those user costs, the additional costs of home ownership, the mortgage payment, the property taxes, any depreciation, any capital gains, any maintenance costs, and any insurance costs. And so we went through this model where we said, okay, we're going to add all of those costs together, and we're going to look at them as a function of quantity and the value of the house. and that basically gives us the user cost associated with homeownership is based on this value, and then that mortgage interest, that property tax, any depreciation, and the capital gains. Because these things are treated differently for homeowners than they are for landlords, we get the tax treatment differences. And that's the crux of this model. That's the heart and soul of this model, is these differences. That not all of the costs are tax deductible for homeowners, and all of the benefits are taxed for landlords. So all of the benefits of home ownership are untaxed for owner-occupiers, but taxed for landlords. And that's where the meat and potatoes of the model we went over on Monday comes from. It's this idea that if we assume everything else is the same, if you're a landlord, you're going to have those benefits of that home ownership, the rental income, and the capital gains taxed, where owners don't pay taxes on those things. And so we can compare the user costs for owner-occupiers to the user costs for landlords by looking at the tax deductibility of that income and those tax rates faced by those individuals. So remember, I don't want you guys to worry about the details of this model. I want you to think more about the function of it and what the model implies. The model implies that tax deductibility of mortgage interest and property taxes means that as owner-occupiers' tax rates go up, the cost of owning a house goes down, right? So say that again, right? If tax rate is proportionate to income, as homeowners see their incomes go up, their tax rate goes up. The higher the tax rate, the greater the benefit of those tax deductions, the greater the benefit of being an owner-occupier. And so what we get is a model that looks at tax rate as the driver of that decision of whether to own or rent. We also talked briefly last time about inflation and housing bubbles, and how generally inflation is going to make homes look like great assets, and it's also going to reduce user costs and encourage home ownership. And it contributed to, in many ways, the housing crisis, right? Those inflationary pressures decrease the cost of lending by decreasing the real interest rate, and they increase the gains associated with home ownership. They make it look like homes are this great asset because the inflation means that the value of the price is always going up. When we look at the user cost of rental housing, we see it's going to be a little bit different. We've still got that tax rate here, but now we've got the rental price that they get paid, and they're taxed on that, right? They're taxed on that income from the rent. They're taxed on capital gains, and that means that their profit is going to be reduced by their tax rate. Excuse me. So if we assume that market's clear, which we always do, then we're going to see that the user cost of rental housing is going to be equal to the price of that housing, and it's going to be a function of those user costs. So when we look at this model of tenure choice, and again, this is a simple model. We talked about the flaws of it on Monday, right? It doesn't cover everything. It doesn't yet talk about things like down payment or the probability of getting a mortgage or that kind of thing. But if we just assume that its tenure choice is a function of these user costs, a rational consumer is going to compare the user cost of being an owner-occupier or being a landlord, and knowing that's going to be passed on to the renter when they make the decision of whether to rent or own. And so we model it based on the user costs of our individuals. The problem is our model as it stands doesn't help us explain why we see so many U.S. households rent, and so we have to add in excess depreciation or accelerated depreciation. Accelerated depreciation is tax deductible for landlords, and that gives us this slightly more complicated user cost for landlord equation, but it gets us to this model where we see that the decision of whether to rent or own is a function of whether the user cost for owners is higher or the user cost for renters is higher. Since user costs fall as the tax rate for owner-occupiers goes up, we're going to see owner-occupiers more likely win their higher tax rates, right? Renters' user costs don't depend on their tax rates, and so that's a horizontal line. And so that intersection is sort of that equilibrium that gives us the breakdown between who rents and who owns. And it's a function of that decision of what's the higher cost. So like I said, when we went over this on Monday, the important thing here is to understand that the variation in the model and the equilibrium come from the differences in how the benefits are taxed. Owner-occupiers don't pay taxes on the benefits of housing, and they get the benefit of all those tax deductibilities, whereas renters are taxed on the benefits of housing. And so if a person is trying to make that decision of whether to rent or own based only on the user cost, it's going to be a function of their tax rate. So renting is cheaper for households with a low tax rate. And so low-income households facing lower tax rates are going to be more likely to be renters than owners. And that's what this model tells us. Cool? We talked about some ways we could change this. We could see if the landlord tax rate increases, that could increase the benefit of excess depreciation, shifting the renter's user cost down. Other factors could shift it, and that could alter the composition of renters and owners, alter that equilibrium outcome. But the big thing here is that it's about tax rate. The higher the tax rate, the greater the benefit to being a homeowner. And we talked about this in class, right? We talked about whether you get an itemized deduction or standard deduction on your taxes. When your income is higher and your tax rate is higher, that tax deductibility is way more important than when your income is lower and you're taxed at a lower rate. The other factors that contribute to tenure choice that the model totally ignores are really important for homeownership though, right? So expected mobility says there are huge costs, transactions costs, and physical costs associated with buying and selling homes. So if you're moving around a lot, buying a home might not make sense. There is a psychological effect, right? There's pride of ownership. People take pride in owning a home relative to being a renter. So that might increase the likelihood of home ownership or shift that, vibe towards housing, home ownership for a housing tenure choice. There is some risk associated with home ownership, and so maybe less risk-averse people might choose renting relative to home ownership. And then we could also see people make the choice to rent because they don't want to be responsible for upkeep. Maybe they have a dislike for home maintenance tasks, although usually maintenance is built into rental costs. So the next part that the model we've just looked at ignores is the down payment requirement. And home buyers typically make a pretty big down payment when purchasing a home. We generally haven't talked about that yet, so we're going to bring in this idea of down payments and house value to get another slightly more realistic model of the decision of how to treat your home and whether or not to own a home. The argument that the book makes is that high tax rate individuals are patient and so they save a down payment and then are more likely to be owner occupiers. But there's other stuff that's built into that. What we want to look at is how a down payment affects mortgage default. And so mortgage default is when a consumer stops making the required mortgage payments on their home loan. And if you default on your mortgage long enough, then you have a foreclosure. The bank forecloses on the house, takes it back from you, and then resells it out into the market. We saw a lot of that at the end of the housing crisis, right? Default prevents the consumer from getting another mortgage by tanking their credit score, and the down payment requirement is designed to reduce the likelihood of default by making people pay some of the money up front and sort of ensuring they're a good credit risk, right? So we're going to model this in a couple of different ways. Let me get my whiteboard. So we assume that a consumer buys a house at a price of V and plans on living in it for a period of time. So V is the value of the house, and the mortgage is how much the loan is for, M, and then D is the down payment. So if my value of my house is $100,000 and I put down $10,000 down payment, the remaining mortgage is the $90,000 that's left. The homeowner vacates at the end of some period of time at which the mortgage is paid using funds from the sale of the house, and V star is then the future value or the sale price of the house. So far, so good? So I buy a house for V, I put down some amount of money for down payment, I make a mortgage, I have a mortgage loan for the rest, and then when I sell the house, I get V star. So if V star is less than the initial purchase price V, if my house goes down in value, I'm more likely to default. And if you think about that, that makes perfect sense, right? If I buy a $100,000 house and now it's only worth $80,000, I still have this massive mortgage I have to pay off, and the house isn't even worth that much. And so if the future value or the sale price, the future sale price of the house is less than the mortgage, then I'm going to be more likely to default on that loan. Does that make sense? If the loan amount that I owe is greater than the sale value, the potential sale value of the house, why would I pay off the mortgage? I'd be better off just not paying off the mortgage, defaulting, and getting out. So if V star minus M is less than 0, the homeowner is left owing more on the mortgage than they can get from the sale of the home, and so it would be rational to default. And this is called the negative equity default rule. It basically says, hey, not everybody who defaults is making an irrational choice. It might be a very rational choice based on low sale prices. And so if we think about the Great Recession, when home prices lost tons of value after having really inflated values, that negative equity default rule came into play for some people, and they might have been rational to default. We have to consider other things. If you do default on a loan, there are other costs incurred by the consumer. You're going to have harm to your credit rating, and that's going to have reverberating effects. There might be some costs associated with moving, finding a new place to live, which might be harder after a default. And then there might be guilt or other psychic costs, reputation costs, something like that, embarrassment. Whatever those costs are, we can still kind of build a modified negative equity default rule by saying, okay, well, if the sale value or the future sale value of the house minus the mortgage is less than the negative costs associated with defaulting, we'll still be rational to do that, to incur those costs, if keeping the house is going to cost us more. And that's really what we're talking about is, are the losses from paying off the mortgage for this low value asset going to be greater than the costs of defaulting? Does that make sense? So a down payment reduces the likelihood of default because it reduces the size of the mortgage, right? It makes the mortgage smaller. If I put down half of the value of the home as a down payment, then my mortgage is going to be a lot smaller than if I put down 1%. So if we rewrite that, we can make the default condition to be this V star, the home sale price, minus whatever the mortgage is, which is going to be equal to the difference between the sale price of the house and the price I purchased it at, the initial value, plus the down payment. Does that make sense? So what we're doing here is we're kind of expanding the model to say, okay, the difference between the value I paid for the house and what I can sell the house for, plus whatever down payment I put down, those are my potential losses associated with default, and there are costs associated with default, but it's going to depend on whether those default costs are greater than the lost value of my home and my down payment. Does that make sense? It's the same thing we're saying, we're just complicating it by adding in the reality of a down payment reducing the size of the mortgage. Does that make sense? I hope so. Let me know if it doesn't. So now default depends on how much the house value changes, how much the down payment was, and what the costs of defaulting are. When we think about the 2008 housing bubble bursting, we saw massive changes in home values. And we saw a lot of those mortgages, especially those subprime mortgages, had really small down payments. And because default was so common, the costs of defaulting were lower. And so it made mortgage default much more rational. Do you see how that follows? Hopefully. Okay. So post-bubble defaults were driven by huge declines in home prices, right? The difference between the price you bought your house for and the price you could sell your house for were large and very negative, right? So houses went down by in some cases 30%. Really small down payments also meant that mortgages were really large. They were a big portion of the total value of the house. So you were much more likely to be what's called underwater on your loan, where your mortgage is worth more than the house itself. And then consumers who became homeowners via subprime mortgages might have already had poor credit, and so they might not have felt the cost of defaulting as much. I don't know if I buy that as strongly. I think the sort of psychic costs of default are pretty significant, but I think when you're in the middle of a wave of defaults, that might be a bigger role too, right? That might alter those costs associated with mortgage default if everybody's doing it. So either way, what we saw in the Great Recession was a ton of mortgages defaulting. So the last couple of things we want to talk about here, now that we've clarified mortgages and down payments and their role in defaulting, is the other aspects that might affect tenure choice, the choice of whether to own a home or rent. And one of the other factors we want to consider is property abuse. And the idea here is that when you rent a place, you might not have the same incentives to take care of the property as you would if it was your own home. Rents are supposed to cover the costs associated with renters' behavior. And so if renters don't take good care of a home in the same way that a homeowner would, it can raise rents in order to cover the cost of that property abuse. And it might make being an owner-occupier more expensive. So we'll model this mathematically like we do everything. But the big idea should be kind of straightforward and intuitive. If renters engage in this property abuse or don't take care of the property, then landlords raise the rents to cover the cost of that property abuse, and the higher rents are going to make home ownership look more affordable. Does that make sense? If not, let's look at it. So here are our variables. We have some operating costs, O, some cost of exercising care in the house, C, some damage to the house, H, the rental price of the property, P, the resale value of the house, V. The operating costs are going to include all of the user costs we've talked about, all of the costs associated with having a house. The value of the house depends on that exercising of care, right? Taking really good care of the house. And it's reduced by damage to the house. And then renters pay P and then choose whether or not to exercise care and spend that extra C. So here we have, and this is the table from the book that looks at the choice of individuals. So owners are going to face a cost function of O plus C if they engage in care, so the operating costs plus the care costs, or O plus D without care, that damage that is incurred to the property from not engaging in care. The owner is going to choose to exercise care because C, the cost of the care is less than the cost of the damage, and so the owner's operating cost is going to be O plus C. Are you with me? It's the sort of intuitive response, right? It's an owner is going to take extra care of their house, even though it comes at a cost, because that cost is less than the cost of damage to the property. A renter, on the other hand, is going to pay the price for housing, and they can either pay price plus the care cost or just the price, P. The renter doesn't care about the damage to the property, so they're going to engage in that property abuse or that lack of care. And so they're going to end up paying P without the C, and that means that the renter's cost is going to be P, which is equal to O plus D. What this is basically saying is owning is going to be cheaper than renting because renters have an incentive to not exercise care, and that's going to cause damage, which is going to raise the cost of renting. It's kind of the most complicated way of saying that. And so I don't want you to get too bogged down with the model part of this and just think about the idea of what property abuse says about tenure choice. If property abuse happens, then that's going to raise rents and make home ownership look more affordable. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Requiring a damage deposit can create an incentive. So, a security deposit is designed to say, hey, you're going to want to take good care of this, so you get your deposit back. And that can basically be a financial incentive that aligns the incentives of the renter with the incentives of the landlord. However, security deposits don't usually cover the maximum potential damage, so it might not be a perfect mechanism. And then the last point here, this high quality rental properties, like the fancier the complex, the higher the damage deposit or the higher the security deposit is going to be a pretty narrow market, right? Not a lot of people are going to be looking for like super expensive rental properties. And so we're going to tend to see this not be as functional as we'd like. So everything we've talked about so far. Hedonic price model treats housing as a bundle of attributes rather than measuring it just in the consumption of square footage or just one function, one quantity, right? We're not just measuring square foot. We're not just measuring how big the house is. We want to know what the components of the house are. Another way of measuring housing was to look at the price elasticity of demand for housing and the income elasticity of demand for housing, and then model it in relationship to expenditure. A more realistic picture of housing includes those user costs, mortgage interest, property taxes, depreciation, capital gains. When we incorporate those elements into, and the tax treatment of those elements, we can compare the choices and the costs associated with home ownership and renting. And we find that the tax deductibility of those things plays a role in someone's decision of whether to own a home or rent. The model predicts that high-income households with high tax rates benefit the most from home ownership, and that low-income households are likely to rent. Price, down payment requirements, and property abuse also affect that tenure choice in the ways we've talked about today in this lecture. Okay? So that's that chapter. That's everything we've got. Okay, so that's housing and tenure choice. Let me know what questions you have. Like I said, I'll put up a discussion thread in Canvas so we can talk about what you think are good and bad and interesting and confusing things about these models and housing tenure choice. I think it's really interesting to talk about housing in this chapter because it's something we interact with, right? You might not deal with traffic that much or pollution or living in a city, but everybody has some kind of housing, and that decision of whether to rent or own is a really big part of that. So let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.